Aachen, Germany, late 1944. If you listen to the pristine radio broadcasts playing in American living rooms, the liberation of European cities was a glorious, triumphant march. They painted pictures of brave Allied infantrymen pushing cleanly through the streets, greeted by cheering crowds as the German war machine crumbled. But down in the shattered, freezing, industrial guts of the city, the reality of urban combat was entirely different. It was a suffocating, hyper-lethal meat grinder of collapsing concrete, hidden snipers, and endless, freezing mud. Trapped deep inside the heavily bombed, flooded ruins of a massive municipal tramway and electrical substation was a detachment of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. They were a segregated, heavy construction company of 40 African-American linemen and communication engineers. In the rigidly prejudiced military hierarchy of the 1940s, these men were not issued heavy Browning machine guns or bazookas. They were handed heavy wooden climbing spikes, thick rubber-insulated pliers, and massive 500-pound wooden spools of raw copper telephone wire. Their only mission was to crawl through the freezing rubble and re-establish the severed frontline communication networks. But the front line had just violently collapsed inward. Creeping silently through the ruined, skeletal remains of the adjacent city blocks, less than 40 minutes away, was an elite vanguard of Waffen-SS Sturmpionier, the dreaded assault pioneers. They were the absolute apex predators of urban warfare, heavily armed with STG-44 assault rifles, satchel charges, and serrated trench spades. They were moving with terrifying, practiced efficiency through the freezing rain, fully intent on sweeping the ruined tram depot and slaughtering anyone inside to sever the Allied communication lines. Standing directly in the center of the flooded, steel-filled depot, completely cut off from the main infantry advance, were 40 exhausted, entirely unarmed communication workers. And as the distant, terrifying crunch of German jackboots on broken glass echoed through the concrete ruins, the American intelligence command stationed safely in the rear knew exactly what was about to happen. But they did not send an armored Sherman tank to reinforce the perimeter. The high command simply left them in the flooded ruins to die. Just 30 minutes before the heavy, iron-shod boots of the SS assault pioneers crunched over the broken glass of the perimeter, the flooded tram depot was a scene of panicked, absolute betrayal. Idling heavily in the knee-deep, freezing water at the only cleared exit of the municipal ruins was the unit's only operational escape vehicle, a heavily armored, diesel-powered M8 Greyhound scout car. Standing safely behind the thick steel plating of the turret, aggressively wiping the freezing rain from his pristine, tailor-made officer's coat, was their commanding officer. He was a wealthy, aristocratic Army intelligence captain who viewed his assignment to a segregated African-American Signal Corps company as a temporary, insulting stain on his prestigious military record. First Sergeant Grid Carter, his thick canvas uniform entirely soaked through with freezing urban runoff and industrial tram grease, waded across the flooded concrete floor to the armored car. He respectfully informed the captain that the 40 signalmen needed to abandon the massive wooden spools of copper wire and immediately board the exterior of the Greyhound. It was the only vehicle capable of safely breaking through the shattered city streets and reaching the Allied armored columns before the German shock troops slaughtered them all. But the captain did not order his driver to make room. In the rigidly prejudiced hierarchy of the 1944 military machine, the officer did not see 40 brave men who had spent weeks crawling through sniper-infested rubble to keep the frontline communication networks alive. He saw 40 expendable laborers. He saw a fleshy roadblock. "You are a Signal Corps heavy construction company, First Sergeant," the captain shouted, his voice barely cutting through the roaring diesel engine of the scout car and the pouring rain. "Your explicit orders are to protect the municipal infrastructure and splice the main trunk lines. You will not abandon this substation under any circumstances." Carter gripped a heavy, rubber-insulated pair of lineman's pliers, his jaw locked tight. He explained, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, heavy clarity, that they were entirely unarmed. If an elite vanguard of Waffen-SS Sturmpionier breached the flooded depot, Wooden climbing spikes and wire cutters would be mathematically useless against St. G44 assault rifles and high-explosive satchel charges. The captain's face flushed with a cowardly, defensive rage. He pointed a perfectly clean, trembling gloved finger at the massive Detroit high-voltage worker. "I have classified frontline intelligence that I must personally deliver to the battalion command, First Sergeant. You will hold the line and protect the grid. That is a direct order," the captain screamed, completely ignoring the absolute, suicidal absurdity of his command. He did not hand them a single spare crate of Thompson submachine guns. He did not offer to stay and coordinate a defense in the flooded ruins. He simply turned his back, ordered his driver to gun the heavy diesel engine, and the armored scout car violently accelerated through the deep water, disappearing into the blinding, freezing urban rain. The captain explicitly, intentionally abandoned 40 unarmed men in a flooded, inescapable concrete coffin, using their inevitable bloody slaughter to buy himself exactly 30 extra minutes to safely retreat to the armored lines. In the cold, calculating mathematics of war, he looked at a city map and decided that the communication workers were a perfectly acceptable speed bump. The heavy, diesel-choked wake of the armored Greyhound faded completely into the freezing, relentless urban rain. Inside the skeletal, concrete guts of the flooded tram depot, the 40 African-American signalmen stood in absolute silence. They looked at the churning, knee-deep water, and then out toward the shattered city blocks. They could clearly hear the terrifying, distinct clatter of German St. G44 assault rifles, firing short, controlled bursts as the enemy systematically cleared the adjacent ruins. The elite SS assault pioneers were less than 40 minutes away. They were entirely surrounded by collapsed masonry, completely out of ammunition, and mathematically dead. Panic, raw and unadulterated, began to fracture the discipline of the unit. Some men looked desperately at the sheer, crumbling brick walls, contemplating a blind, suicidal run directly into the sniper-infested streets. But First Sergeant Grid Carter did not look at the streets, and he did not panic. Carter was a massive, quiet man whose thick hands were permanently scarred by high-voltage copper burns and heavy industrial climbing spikes. Before the draft board pulled his number, he had never read a military textbook on urban siege tactics or infantry maneuvers. He was a master high-voltage lineman who had spent his entire adult life suspended 50 feet above the concrete canyons of Detroit, wrestling with raw, invisible lime, city-killing electricity. He was a blue-collar genius who intimately understood the terrifying, absolute laws of extreme conductivity, dead shorts, and catastrophic arc flashes. Laws that the aristocratic, silver spoon intelligence officers completely ignored. While the terrified signalmen looked at the flooded depot and saw a watery, inescapable graveyard, Carter looked through the freezing gloom and saw a catastrophic, municipal-scale electric chair waiting to be armed. His intense, dark eyes scanned the massive, heavy-duty electrical infrastructure trapped in the ruins with them. There was a colossal, 2-story municipal step-down transformer banking the far wall, its heavy ceramic insulators miraculously intact and humming with a deep, vibrating resonance. It was still connected to the raw, unsevered main city grid power, and running directly through the center of the flooded concrete floor were the heavy twert, exposed steel tram tracks, currently submerged under 2 feet of highly conductive folt, freezing urban rainwater. To the cowardly captain who had abandoned them, the transformer was just background city rubble. But to a Detroit high-voltage lineman, raw municipal electricity in a flooded steel-lined room was not just infrastructure. It was one of the most violent, deeply lethal forces on the face of the planet when properly manipulated. Carter knew exactly what happened when thousands of amps of unstepped high-voltage current were deliberately bypassed past the safety breakers and dead-shorted directly into a grounded, flooded steel grid. It did not just shock a person. It created a rapidly expanding, highly unstable circuit that would instantly vaporize human nervous systems and turn the entire depot floor into a hyper-lethal, electrified kill zone. Carter slowly waded to the center of the flooded room. He reached down to his heavy leather utility belt and drew a massive, thick pair of rubber-insulated lineman's pliers. He violently slammed the heavy steel jaws against a massive 500-pound spool of raw copper wire. The deafening metallic clang echoed off the wet concrete, snapping the 40 terrified men out of their paralyzing panic. "Listen to me," Carter roared, his deep, gravelly voice echoing off the ruined walls. "The brass wrote us off. They think we're just a bunch of telephone operators holding pliers. They expect us to fight SS stormtroopers with bullets we do not have." Carter wiped the freezing, grease-stained rain from his face, his gaze turning incredibly cold and completely focused. He pointed his heavy rubber pliers directly at the violently humming municipal transformer and the flooded steel tracks submerged beneath their boots. "We are not going to do that. I am a lineman, and we are going to fight them with the grid." For the next 20 agonizing minutes, the flooded, skeletal guts of the tram depot ceased to be a doomed graveyard. It transformed into a frantic, blindingly efficient industrial forge of desperate survival. The 40 African-American signalmen did not scatter into the freezing rubble. The paralyzing terror that had gripped them just half an hour before was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly focused mechanical rage. They were fighting for their right to exist, using the exact heavy-duty tools the military establishment had mocked them for holding. Following First Sergeant Carter's exact, calculated orders, the splashing of freezing water and the heavy, metallic snapping of thick wire violently shattered the silence of the ruins. A dozen men sprinted to the massive, 500-pound wooden spools of heavy-gauge communication wire. Wielding their heavy linemen's pliers, they did not just cut the lines, they violently stripped away hundreds of feet of the thick black rubber insulation, exposing massive coils of raw, highly conductive, naked copper. Then came the mechanical trap. Carter ordered his most experienced climbers to scale the massive, 2-story municipal transformer banking the far wall. Using heavy, rubber-insulated gloves, they intentionally bypassed every single failsafe, fuse, and step-down safety breaker on the municipal grid. They took the stripped, naked copper lines and bolted them directly to the raw, high-voltage primary feed coming straight from the city's main power plant. They were tapping into thousands of unstepped, unregulated amps of raw, urban electricity. The colossal ceramic insulators hummed with immense, unnatural kinetic tension. Dozens of exhausted linemen formed a desperate, rapid-fire, heavy-lifting team in the knee-deep water. They dragged the other end of the heavy, naked copper cables directly into the center of the flooded depot floor. With terrifying precision, they began wrapping the raw copper tightly around the massive, submerged steel tram tracks. Because the freezing urban rainwater was completely saturated with industrial iron rust and dissolved urban salts, it had become a hyperconductive electrolytic bath. By bonding the raw, high-voltage feed directly to the submerged steel tracks, Carter was turning the entire knee-deep flood into a colossal, macroscopic electrode. The entire flooded tram depot was now an invisible, highly unstable, and utterly lethal high-voltage circuit waiting to be closed. And hidden perfectly on a dry, elevated concrete gantry overlooking the flooded floor, First Sergeant Grid Carter stood directly next to a massive cast-iron industrial disconnect switch. It was the only thing keeping the raw city power from violently dumping into the water below. His calloused, scarred hand rested firmly on the heavy rubber handle. The trap was locked. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were entirely abandoned in a flooded, freezing urban ruin, surrounded by elite SS stormtroopers, and all you had was a pair of rubber pliers and raw city electricity? Would you try your luck in the sniper-infested streets, or would you trust a Detroit high-voltage lineman to build an impossible electric snare? Let me know exactly what you would do right now, because this municipal grid is about to violently erase the enemy. Through the relentless, freezing downpour of the Aachen urban winter, the shattered steel doors of the tram depot were violently kicked off their rusted hinges. The elite vanguard of the Waffen-SS Sturmpionier had breached the perimeter. Over 80 battle-hardened assault pioneers poured into the flooded, skeletal guts of the municipal ruins, moving with a terrifying, synchronized lethality. Their heavy, camouflage smocks were completely soaked, and the dull, stamped steel barrels of their St. G-44 assault rifles swept the dark, rain-swept corners of the depot as they instantly fanned out, their heavy jackboots violently splashing into the knee-deep water. Standing just inside the shattered entrance, peering through the freezing gloom, was the SS Sturmbannführer. He lowered his MP-40 submachine gun, his scarred, aristocratic face twisting into a mask of pure, tactical confusion. There were no reinforced sandbag barricades. There were no heavy, 50 caliber machine guns covering the entrance. There was not a single American infantryman in sight. Through the heavy rain pouring from the collapsed roof, the German commander saw only the massive spools, 500-pound wooden spools of telephone wire. Men, he saw hundreds of feet of thick, black rubber insulation floating uselessly in the freezing min. Rust-colored water. He saw raw men, naked copper wrapped haphazardly around the submerged steel tram tracks. Men leading toward the massive silent transformer bank on the far wall. A slow, deeply arrogant smirk spread across the hardened commander's face. To the highly trained elite urban shock troop commander, the scene was an absolute display of pathetic American logistical incompetence and blind, humiliating panic. He assumed the terrified, unarmed communication laborers had desperately tried to salvage their copper wire, realized they were about to be slaughtered, and blindly fled into the sniper-infested city blocks, dropping their heavy spools mid-task. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, ha! Barking laugh of pure tactical contempt that echoed off the wet concrete walls. Huh! He barked a relaxed, ha! Aggressive order in German, ha! Slinging his weapon over his shoulder and pulling a silver cigarette case from his tunic. The intense, lethal tension among the raiding party completely evaporated. The apex predators of the European theater lowered their assault rifles, their rigid combat discipline melting into arrogant victory. They began to casually wade into the center of the flooded depot, laughing, shouting to one another, and eagerly approaching the abandoned spools of copper to claim their scavenged prize. They were standing at exact ground zero, in the deepest, most enclosed section of the flooded municipal grid. Because electricity is completely invisible, the German stormtroopers had absolutely no idea they were not walking into a deserted communication outpost. They were marching knee-deep into a massive, highly conductive electrolytic bath, perfectly grounded to the submerged steel tracks and wired directly to thousands of unstepped amps of raw city power. And hidden perfectly in the dark, freezing shadows of the elevated concrete gantry directly above them, First Sergeant Grid Carter gripped the heavy, cast-iron handle of the master disconnect switch. His scarred, calloused hands were completely steady. The trap was locked. To the arrogant SS Sturmbannführer, the massive, humming ceramic insulators on the far wall were just background city noise. He brushed a freezing raindrop from his iron cross, completely ignoring the terrifying, invisible science of the trap he and his elite urban assault pioneers had just waded blindly into. In standard residential electricity, a short circuit trips a small breaker, shutting off the power before the wires can overheat. But First Sergeant Carter had not just laid bare wire on the floor. He had intentionally bypassed every single massive industrial safety breaker on the municipal grid. He had directly connected the raw, unregulated primary feed of the entire city of Aachen to the submerged steel tram tracks. He was dealing with tens of thousands of amps of available fault current. And that level of raw electrical energy completely alters the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. When a dead short of that colossal magnitude occurs, the electricity does not just flow through the copper wire. It violently exceeds the physical capacity of the metal to carry it. The extreme, localized resistance generates instantaneous temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, upwards of 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that hyperthermal temperature, the heavy, solid copper wire does not just melt. It violently undergoes a catastrophic phase change. It instantly vaporizes into a blinding, highly conductive plasma. And in the terrifying, absolute mathematics of high-voltage electrical engineering, When solid copper vaporizes into plasma, it instantaneously expands to 67,000 times its original volume. Carter had not just built an electrified puddle. He had meticulously engineered a macroscopic, municipal-scale arc flash. It is the absolute deadliest, most explosive electrical phenomenon on Earth, a catastrophic event that combines a blinding thermal flashbang with a supersonic, concussive pressure wave of expanding metallic vapor. The elite SS shock troops were literally wading knee-deep through the primary conduit of a highly unstable, city-killing plasma bomb. All that was missing was the closed circuit. Down on the flooded concrete, the German commander finally noticed the intense, unnatural vibration of the water against his jackboots. He stopped laughing, his eyes widening in sudden, terrifying realization as he heard the massive, vibrating hum of the overloaded transformers reaching a deafening, unnatural pitch. He frantically raised his MP-40, screaming an order to fall back to the shattered doors. He was exactly 1 second too late. High up in the dark, freezing shadows of the concrete gantry, First Sergeant Carter did not have an artillery barrage to call in. He did not need one. He firmly gripped the heavy, rubber-insulated handle of the municipal disconnect switch, the absolute last physical barrier holding back a city's worth of raw, roaring electrical destruction. With a violently swift motion, First Sergeant Grid Carter threw his entire body weight against the heavy, rubber-insulated handle of the municipal disconnect switch. He did not just close the circuit. He violently slammed the massive copper contacts together, instantly dumping tens of thousands of unstepped, unregulated amps of raw city power directly into the flooded floor of the depot. The blinding, terrifying laws of high-voltage physics took absolute, instantaneous control. It was not a localized electrical shock. It was a catastrophic, municipal-scale arc flash. The moment the raw, colossal current hit the stripped, naked copper wire wrapped around the submerged steel tracks, the metal catastrophically failed under the extreme resistance. Reaching temperatures upwards of 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hundreds of feet of heavy, solid copper wire instantly and violently vaporized. A blinding, impossible flash of pure, hyperthermal blue-white plasma erupted from the knee-deep water. The ignition flash baked the freezing urban rain simultaneously. Because vaporizing copper instantaneously expands to 67,000 times its original solid volume, the resulting supersonic shockwave of raw, unadulterated kinetic pressure and hyperthermal heat slammed into the elite SS assault pioneers with the crushing, inescapable force of a point-blank artillery strike. The physics of the enclosed, flooded depot were completely merciless. The heavy, skeletal concrete walls directed the colossal concussive shockwave entirely inward and upward. The expanding pressure wave traveled significantly faster than the speed of sound, violently lifting the battle-hardened German stormtroopers entirely off their feet, rendering their STG-44 assault rifles and high-explosive satchel charges mathematically useless against a wall of expanding plasma. But the concussive kinetic force was only the first half of the execution. The colossal blue-white fireball violently expanded, while the heavily flooded, knee-deep electrolytic bath simultaneously became a massive, inescapable grid of highly lethal voltage. The apex predators of urban warfare, men who had ruthlessly conquered shattered European cities, were instantly neutralized by the terrifying realities of the American electrical grid. They were simultaneously incinerated by the expanding copper plasma, crushed by the sheer atmospheric vacuum of the vaporization, and violently electrocuted by the flooded municipal tracks. The colossal, blinding electrical flash snapped out of existence, violently throwing the massive industrial circuit breakers at the city's main power plant and plunging the ruined depot entirely back into darkness. It left behind a deafening, ringing silence, punctuated only by the heavy hiss of boiling, electrified water and the falling rain. High up on the dry, elevated concrete gantry, far above the blast zone, First Sergeant Grid Carter and the 40 African-American signalmen slowly stood up. 40. Abandoned, completely unarmed communication workers had just weaponized the terrifying, invisible physics of high-voltage electricity to entirely erase an elite Waffen-SS vanguard from the face of the earth. 4 agonizing hours after the catastrophic arc flash, the relentless, freezing urban rain of Aachen continued to wash over the shattered city. Cutting through the heavy downpour and the distant rumble of artillery was the heavy, diesel-choked roar of the M8 Greyhound armored scout car returning through the skeletal streets. Standing safely behind the heavy steel turret plating, entirely dry and completely detached from the horrors of the urban meat grinder, was the aristocratic Army intelligence captain. He was returning to the municipal depot with a heavily armed squad of infantry reinforcements, fully expecting to find a butchered, blood-soaked graveyard of 40 expendable communication workers. He had already mentally drafted the sanitized casualty report, prepared to write off their deaths as a necessary tactical sacrifice to secure his classified intelligence. But as the heavy armored car splashed to a halt at the flooded entrance of the tram depot, the captain's polished leather boots stopped dead on the steel running board. The depot was not a graveyard of American linemen. It was a violently scorched, ozone-choked crater of flash-baked concrete and boiling floodwater. The immense thermobaric shockwave of the expanding copper plasma had completely blown out every remaining brick wall of the facility, twisting massive steel support beams like cheap tin. The knee-deep urban rainwater was still violently steaming from the hyperthermal flash. The air was thick with the suffocating metallic stench of vaporized metal and raw ozone, and scattered across the blackened, glass-like surface of the blasted concrete were the neutralized remains of the elite Waffen-SS assault pioneers. They had not been shot. They had been entirely eradicated by a catastrophic thermal flash, concussive vacuum pressure, and catastrophic electrocution. The captain's jaw dropped in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. He stepped tentatively into the blast zone, his infantry escorts gripping their M1 Garands in sheer awe at the apocalyptic destruction. And then, stepping slowly out from the dark, freezing shadows of the elevated concrete gantry, came the phantoms. One by one, the 40 African-American signalmen stepped into the pale, freezing light. They were completely covered in thick black soot, heavy industrial tram grease, and the unmistakable, acrid stench of burned ozone. They were exhausted, their muscles completely drained by the extreme, sustained adrenaline of their impossible survival. But they were entirely, undeniably, alive. First Sergeant Grid Carter, his massive frame towering over the violently scorched remains of a German satchel charge, wiped a thick layer of toxic metallic ash from his scarred face. He stared directly through the cowardly officer. He did not salute. He just held his heavy, rubber-insulated lineman's pliers. "Depot secured, Captain," Carter's deep, gravelly voice cut through the freezing rain. "Enemy assault vanguard has been entirely neutralized." The captain stared at the massive Detroit high-voltage worker, his aristocratic face flushing a violent, defensive crimson. He looked at the apocalyptic destruction of the municipal grid, and then at the unarmed communication laborers holding climbing spikes and wire cutters. "What in God's name happened here, First Sergeant?" the captain stammered, his voice laced with sudden, terrified panic. "Did a stray heavy artillery shell hit the transformer bank? Did the Germans detonate a massive demolition cache?" "No artillery, sir," Carter replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble of pure working-class fury. "We bypassed the municipal step-down breakers. We dead-shorted the unstepped primary high-voltage feed directly into the flooded steel tracks. We vaporized the solid copper lines to engineer a catastrophic arc flash and electrified the entire electrolytic flood." The captain stared at Carter in absolute, sickening denial. The mathematical brilliance of the trap, the fact that a segregated, blue-collar utility worker had engineered a highly complex, supersonic thermobaric plasma explosion using nothing but raw city voltage and a flooded room, fundamentally shattered his deeply prejudiced worldview. Acknowledging that genius would completely humiliate him and his prestigious Ivy League military training. "You expect me to believe a squad of uneducated telephone pole climbers built a municipal plasma bomb in a puddle?" the captain spat, his voice echoing with absolute, arrogant dismissal. "That is scientifically absurd. A freak lightning strike obviously hit the exposed transformers. It was a catastrophic act of nature." Carter's jaw locked tight. The 39 men behind him froze, the crushing, suffocating weight of the profound betrayal settling over them in the freezing rain. They had commanded the terrifying, invisible physics of high-voltage municipal electricity, annihilated an elite apex predator without firing a single bullet, and survived the darkest, wettest nightmare of the European urban war. And the cowardly establishment was about to violently erase every single second of it. "You maliciously destroyed thousands of dollars of vital Allied municipal infrastructure and deliberately sabotaged the primary electrical grid of this city," the captain roared, his voice dripping with aristocratic venom, completely ignoring the sheer impossibility of the signalmen's survival or the apocalyptic graveyard of elite SS stormtroopers around them. He turned frantically to his heavily armed infantry escorts, who were staring at the violently flash-baked, ozone-scorched concrete of the blasted depot in absolute awe. "Confiscate their tools immediately. Arrest First Sergeant Carter," the captain barked, completely erasing the heroism of the Signal Corps Company to protect his own shiny brass insignia. "I am charging him with gross negligence, dereliction of duty, and the willful, unauthorized destruction of critical municipal property." The infantrymen nervously leveled their M1 Garands at the 40 exhausted men who had just saved the entire Allied urban flank from a devastating communication blackout and a lethal ambush. The betrayal was absolute, crushing, and infinitely colder than the freezing German rain. They had looked at a flooded, inescapable tomb, weaponized the terrifying invisible physics of high-voltage conductivity and expanding plasma, and entirely annihilated an elite vanguard of apex predators. And their only reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders, their unimaginable, physics-defying tactical genius completely erased, stolen, and buried by the very establishment that had left them in the water to die. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Grid Carter or the Copper Phantom in your standard World War II history textbooks. The Allied High Command completely sanitized the official after-action reports. The catastrophic destruction of the elite Waffen-SS Vanguard was officially classified as a mass casualty event caused by a catastrophic, naturally occurring lightning strike on exposed municipal transformers. The 40 brave, blue-collar linemen of the Signal Corps were quietly split up and shipped to other forgotten telegraph details, their records permanently sealed, and their incredible, working-class brilliance completely buried beneath mountains of redacted, classified paperwork. But the truth is permanently scorched into the violently flash-baked concrete of that Aachen tram depot. The truth lives in the calloused, burn-scarred hands of the working-class men who actually bleed in the deepest, most dangerous corners of the earth, while the cowards at the very top steal all the glory and hide the evidence. Tell me in the comments, have you ever pulled off the absolute impossible at your job? Saving a massive project from complete disaster, only to have a toxic, arrogant manager entirely steal your credit? Or worse, try to punish you for the exact way you fixed it? Flood the comment section with your stories right now, because exposing the truth is the only way we honor the ghosts of the urban grid.